Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. Imagine living in the middle of a giant HOA neighborhood, but your house is the one property they can't control. Then the HOA president starts filming your backyard BBQ and hits you with a $500 noise fine like she owns your deed. The scary part? She threatened a lien, so I went to the county and found something she really didn't want me to see. First, some background that'll make this whole thing make sense. My house sits in what's basically a donut hole in the middle of a massive subdivision. 10 years ago, when developers came sniffing around our old farming community, my grandfather refused to sell the family property. He'd lived here since the 1940s and wasn't about to let some city slickers bulldoze his workshop and garden just so they could cram another cookie-cutter house onto the lot. The developers tried everything to get him to sell. They offered double market value, then triple. They brought in lawyers who explained how much easier it would be for everyone if he just took their generous offer. My grandfather listened politely to every pitch, then told them he wasn't interested in their money or their vision for the neighborhood. So while everything around us got turned into this place called Whispering Pines, complete with identical beige houses and perfectly manicured lawns, our little craftsman home stayed put. The developers had to design their subdivision around us, creating streets that curved awkwardly to avoid our property line and leaving us sitting right in the middle of their planned community like a stubborn island. When I inherited the place 3 years ago after my grandfather passed, I loved that it had character. Real wooden shutters that were painted forest green instead of regulation beige, a wraparound porch with actual personality, and a garden that actually looked like people lived there instead of some magazine photo. The house had been built in 1952, and every room told a story of the family that had lived there for decades. The contrast with the surrounding neighborhood was stark. While the HOA houses all looked like they'd been stamped out by the same machine, our place had quirks and character. The mailbox was hand-forged iron that my grandfather had made in his workshop. The front walkway was made of irregular flagstones that he'd laid himself, each one chosen for its unique shape and color. The garden beds followed natural curves instead of straight lines, and we had actual fruit trees that dropped apples and pears depending on the season. The HOA folks next door always seemed bothered by our place. While their yards looked like pudding greens, ours had wildflowers, vegetable patches, and fruit trees that dropped leaves on the perfectly swept sidewalks. I'd catch neighbors staring over the fence sometimes, and I could practically hear them thinking about how our property was messing up their pristine little bubble. I'd lived there for almost 3 years before the real trouble started, and during that time I'd noticed some interesting patterns. The HOA had very specific ideas about what constituted acceptable neighborhood aesthetics. Grass had to be a particular shade of green and cut to an exact height. Flower beds could only contain approved plant varieties arranged in symmetrical patterns. Even mailboxes had to conform to one of 3 approved designs, all in variations of beige or brown. My property violated basically every one of these unwritten rules, and I could tell it bothered certain neighbors. Most people were friendly enough when we crossed paths on the sidewalk, but there was always this undercurrent of disapproval, like they thought my grandfather's house was bringing down their property values just by existing. The worst offender was the woman who lived directly behind us. Let's call her Brenda, because that's exactly the kind of name that fits a middle-aged woman with nothing better to do than police her neighbors. Brenda had been HOA president for the past 4 years, and boy did she take that job seriously. I'd see her walking around the neighborhood with a clipboard, measuring grass heights and taking photos of anything that looked even slightly out of place. Brenda was the type of person who had apparently never encountered a rule she didn't want to enforce with military precision. She'd been known to knock on doors at 7 in the morning to inform residents that their newspapers were sitting on the driveway for too long, or that their garbage cans were positioned 3 inches outside the approved placement zone. Her own house was like a monument to HOA compliance. Every blade of grass was exactly regulation height, her flower beds contained only approved plants arranged in perfect geometric patterns, and her mailbox looked like it had been installed with a level and measuring tape. She'd painted her house the exact shade of beige recommended in the community guidelines, and had even installed matching beige outdoor furniture that looked like it had never been sat in. But what really bothered me about Brenda was the way she looked at my property. Not just disapproval, but genuine hostility. Like my grandfather's house house was personally insulting her by existing, I'd catch her standing at her back fence, arms crossed, staring at our vegetable garden like it was some kind of neighborhood blight. She never actually talked to me directly during those first 3 years, but I'd gotten the stink eye plenty of times when I was working in the garden. My tomato plants apparently offended her sense of order, and don't even get me started on her reaction when I installed a bird bath that wasn't regulation beige. She'd actually called someone about that, though since I wasn't in the HOA, nothing came of it. There had been smaller incidents over the years that should have been warning signs, like the time I found a note tucked under my car windshield suggesting that I consider painting my front door a more appropriate color, or when she'd made pointed comments to other neighbors about how certain properties didn't maintain community standards, always while standing where I could overhear. The breaking point came during my second summer in the house. I'd planted sunflowers along the back fence, partly because they're beautiful and partly because I knew they'd grow tall enough to give me some privacy from Brenda's constant surveillance. When those sunflowers reached about 6 feet tall, she'd actually called the city to complain about them blocking her view. The city inspector who came out was a nice guy who took one look at the situation and basically told Brenda that sunflowers in someone's own backyard weren't a code violation. But the fact that she'd tried to use city resources to get rid of my flowers told me everything I needed to know about how far she was willing to go. After that incident, I started paying closer attention to Brenda's behavior. I noticed she had a routine where she'd walk the neighborhood every evening around 6, always carrying that clipboard and often stopping to take photos of things she considered problematic. She'd document everything from grass that looked a day overdue for cutting to outdoor decorations that weren't seasonally appropriate. What really bothered me was how she'd park herself at the fence whenever I was doing yard work. Not helping, not making conversation, just watching and occasionally making notes on her clipboard. It felt like living under surveillance, which I suppose was exactly what she intended. Things came to a head on a Saturday in September. I'd been meaning to have a little housewarming party ever since moving in, and my birthday was coming up, so I figured I'd kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Nothing crazy, just 4 friends coming over for burgers and beer on the back deck. I'd actually been planning this gathering for weeks. My college roommate was driving down from the next state, along with 2 couples from work who'd become good friends. These weren't party animals or troublemakers, just normal adults in their 30s who wanted to catch up over food and drinks. We set up around noon, got the grill going, and had some music playing from a little Bluetooth speaker. Classic rock, nothing too loud, just background noise while we caught up and enjoyed the perfect weather. The kind of gathering that happens in backyards across America every weekend. I'd made sure to keep things reasonable from the start. The music was set low enough that we could have conversations without raising our voices. We were sitting around a patio table, not running around the yard or being disruptive. The most exciting thing we did was play a couple rounds of cornhole, which is about as low-key as outdoor games get. My friends had actually commented on how peaceful the neighborhood seemed. One couple mentioned they were thinking about moving to a similar community and wanted to know what it was like living there. I'd explained about the HOA situation surrounding us and how my property was technically independent, which led to some interesting discussions about property rights and community living. Around 2:30, I noticed some movement in Brenda's yard. She'd come outside and was pretending to do some kind of garden work near the fence that separated our properties. Except instead of actually working, she kept glancing over at our gathering and making what looked like notes on a small pad. At first I thought maybe she was just curious about the visitors, which seemed normal enough, but as I watched her more closely, I realized she wasn't gardening at all. She was conducting some kind of surveillance operation, documenting everything about our little party. Around 3:30, she stopped pretending to garden altogether. She just stood there at her back fence with her phone, pointing it directly at our group. At first I thought maybe she was taking pictures of her own yard, but when I looked closer, she was definitely filming us. My buddy noticed too and asked if everything was okay with the neighbor. I shrugged it off, figuring she was probably just being nosy. We weren't doing anything wrong, just having a quiet conversation and enjoying some music at a reasonable volume. But Brenda wasn't just casually observing, she was being methodical about it. She'd take photos from different angles, hold her phone up like she was recording video, and even walk to different spots along the fence to get various perspectives. At one point, she disappeared into her house and came back with what looked like a real camera with a zoom lens. The whole thing was making my friends uncomfortable. One of them asked if we should move the party inside, but I refused to be driven off my own deck by someone who had no authority over what I did on my property. If Brenda wanted to waste her Saturday afternoon playing amateur detective, that was her choice. She stayed there for a solid 40 minutes, documenting our gathering like she was collecting evidence for a criminal trial. She had this smug expression like she'd caught us robbing a bank or something. At one point, I even waved at her, which seemed to annoy her because she quickly turned away and went back to her pretend gardening. Finally, around 4:15, she went back inside, and I forgot about the whole weird display. My friends and I finished our burgers, played another round of cornhole, and called it a day around 6. Everyone had work on Monday, so nobody was interested in staying late or making it into anything more than a pleasant afternoon. As my friends were leaving, one of them mentioned how strange it was that the neighbor had been so obviously watching us. He asked if that kind of thing happened often, and I admitted that Brenda had a reputation for being overly interested in neighborhood activities. But even I didn't expect what came next. Monday evening, I found something interesting in my mailbox. A very official-looking letter with the Whispering Pines HOA logo at the top. It was addressed to me personally and marked as a notice of violation, printed on heavy cardstock that was clearly meant to look important and intimidating. The letter informed me that I was being fined $500 for violating Bylaw 4.2, which apparently covered excessive noise levels and unauthorized social gatherings. According to the notice, my Saturday afternoon barbecue had exceeded acceptable decibel limits and constituted a public disturbance. The letter was signed by Brenda in her capacity as HOA president and gave me until Friday to pay the fine or face additional penalties. What really got to me was how detailed and official this thing looked. It referenced specific times down to the minute, claiming that noise violations had occurred between 1:47 p.m. and 4:23 p.m. It mentioned photographic and video evidence, noise level measurements, and even cited specific sections of the community bylaws that I'd allegedly violated. The letter also included language about how payment could be made, either by check or money order, and warned that failure to comply would result in additional administrative fees and potential legal action. It looked like something that might come from a legitimate legal authority, which I'm sure was exactly the effect Brenda was going for. I read the thing 3 times before it really sank in. This woman was trying to fine me $500 for having 4 friends over for burgers. Not only that, but she'd spent her Saturday afternoon gathering evidence to build some kind of case against me. Now, I'm not the type to just roll over when someone tries to push me around, but I also believe in giving people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had complained to her and she was just following protocol without realizing the situation. So Tuesday evening, I walked over to her house to have a polite conversation and clear things up. I figured a simple explanation about my property's status would resolve the whole thing, and we could all move on with our lives. Brenda's house was everything you'd expect from an HOA president. Perfect lawn with edges sharp enough to cut yourself on, not a single weed in sight, and flower beds that looked like they'd been arranged with a ruler. Even her driveway was pressure washed, to the point where it looked like new concrete. I knocked on her front door, and after a minute she appeared behind the screen door but didn't open it. Right away, I could tell this wasn't going to be the friendly conversation I'd hoped for. She looked at me like I was some kind of door-to-door salesman she couldn't wait to get rid of. I explained that I'd gotten her letter and wanted to discuss it. I told her there must be some kind of mistake because I wasn't part of the HOA. Simple misunderstanding, right? Wrong. Brenda looked at me through that screen door like I'd just claimed the earth was flat. She informed me that everyone in this community was subject to HOA rules and that living in a civilized neighborhood required maintaining certain standards. When I tried to explain about my grandfather's property, she cut me off. According to Brenda, it didn't matter what I thought about my property status. The HOA had jurisdiction over noise violations anywhere in the subdivision boundaries, and if I didn't pay the fine by Friday, they would place a lien on my house. She said this with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged in her life. I asked if I could get a copy of the HOA boundary map and the specific noise measurements she'd referenced in the letter. That's when her whole attitude shifted from smug to hostile. She told me that all the information I needed was in the letter, and if I had questions about HOA policies, I could contact their management company during business hours. Then she informed me that I could expect to hear from their lawyer soon if I didn't take care of the matter promptly. When I tried to explain again that my property wasn't subject to HOA authority, she actually laughed. She said that everyone always tries to find loopholes when they get caught breaking rules, but that the community standards applied to everyone equally. Then she slammed the inner door, leaving me standing on her porch like some door-to-door salesman she'd just dismissed. Walking home, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. This woman was seriously trying to extort money from me based on her own inflated sense of authority. But more than that, she was threatening to put a lien on my house over a backyard barbecue. The harassment escalated from there, and it became clear that Brenda wasn't just confused about my HOA status. She was waging a deliberate campaign to force me into compliance with her authority. Wednesday morning, I found a note under my car windshield wiper informing me that my front door color was not in compliance with community standards. The note was handwritten on official HOA stationery and referenced specific color guidelines that my forest green door allegedly violated. Thursday brought another note, this one about my landscaping choices being inappropriate for the neighborhood aesthetic. According to Brenda's assessment, my wildflower garden created an unkempt appearance that detracted from property values. She suggested I consider replacing the flowers with approved ground cover options, but Friday brought the real kicker. Another official letter, this one marked as a final demand. The original $500 fine had somehow grown to $1,200, including what they called administrative legal fees and a late payment penalty. The letter threatened immediate legal action if payment wasn't received within 48 hours. This second letter was even more detailed than the first. It included a breakdown of charges, citing additional violations like non-compliant exterior paint and unapproved landscaping features. It also mentioned that the HOA had consulted with their legal counsel and was prepared to pursue all available remedies to collect the outstanding debt. The letter was written in language clearly designed to intimidate someone who didn't know better. It talked about property liens, credit reporting, and potential court costs in a way that made it sound like I was already in serious legal trouble. That's when I realized Brenda wasn't just confused about my HOA status. She was deliberately using the HOA's official authority to bully me into submission. She figured I'd be too intimidated by the legal-sounding language to fight back and would just pay the money to make the problem go away. She figured wrong. Saturday morning, I drove downtown to the county assessor's office. I spent the better part of the afternoon gathering every document related to my property, and what I'd discovered was even better than I'd hoped. The county assessor's office was one of those government buildings that feels like it hasn't been updated since the 1970s. Fluorescent lights, beige everything, and the smell of old paperwork. But the clerk who helped me was incredibly knowledgeable and seemed genuinely interested in my situation. I explained what was happening with the HOA, and she immediately understood the issue. Apparently, donut hole properties aren't that uncommon, especially in areas where rapid development has occurred around existing homesteads. She told me she'd seen similar cases before and knew exactly what documents I'd need. First, she pulled up the original deed from my grandfather, which clearly showed the property boundaries and included specific language about the land being held independent of any future development. The deed was recorded in 1947, decades before the subdivision was even conceived. Next, we looked at the subdivision plat maps from when Whispering Pines was developed. These maps showed the entire planned community, but my grandfather's property was clearly marked as existing property, not included. The developers had literally designed their street layout around our lot, creating the awkward curves and dead-end sections that accommodate our property boundaries. But the real gold mine was what the clerk called the exemption documentation. When the HOA was legally established, they had to file specific paperwork with the county outlining their jurisdiction and authority. This paperwork explicitly excluded my address from their covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Not only was I not subject to HOA authority, but there was official county documentation proving it. The clerk also provided me with a certified letter from the county's Property Records Division, officially confirming my property's non-HOA status. This wasn't just some informal note, but an official document with the county seal that could be used in legal proceedings if necessary. As I was gathering these documents, the clerk mentioned something interesting. She said that threatening to place a false lien on someone's property could constitute a form of fraud, especially if the person making the threat knew they had no legal authority to do so. She suggested I might want to document everything Brenda had done and consider filing a complaint with the county's property fraud division. The paperwork told a clear story. When the developers created Whispering Pines, they had to work around existing properties that wouldn't sell. My grandfather's lot was specifically excluded from all HOA covenants and restrictions. It was right there in black and white, recorded with the county and available to anyone who bothered to check. But I wasn't just going to send Brenda a polite note explaining her mistake. She'd threatened to put a lien on my house, had been harassing me for days, and was clearly using her position to settle what amounted to a personal vendetta. Time to play hardball. I spent Sunday afternoon at the local law library researching property law and HOA regulations. I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what legal principles applied to my situation and what remedies might be available if Brenda continued her harassment. What I learned was fascinating and more than a little scary. HOA disputes can get incredibly complicated, especially when property boundaries and jurisdiction are involved. I read case studies about homeowners who'd been tied up in court for years over HOA issues, spending tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. But I also learned about something called tortious interference, which basically means using your position or authority to interfere with someone else's property rights when you have no legal basis for doing so. The more I read, the more I realize that Brenda's actions could potentially expose her and the entire HOA board to serious legal liability. I drafted a letter, but not to Brenda directly. I addressed it to the entire HOA board of directors, sending copies to all 5 members via certified mail. In the letter, I didn't just explain that I wasn't subject to HOA authority. I went further. The letter was 3 pages long and laid out the situation in clear professional language. I started by explaining my property's history and included copies of all the relevant county documents. I made it clear that I wasn't just claiming exemption from HOA authority, but that I had official documentation proving it. Then I got to the meat of the issue. I pointed out that Brenda had threatened to place a false lien on my property, which could constitute fraud and harassment under state law. I mentioned that I had photographic evidence of her trespassing on my property to leave harassing notes. I requested an immediate cease and desist of all communication and demands related to my property. I also demanded reimbursement for my time and stress dealing with what I characterized as fraudulent claims. I cited the specific county statutes about harassment and property disputes, and mentioned that I was considering filing a formal complaint about the misuse of HOA authority. The letter concluded by stating that while I hoped to resolve the matter amicably, I was prepared to take whatever legal action necessary to protect my property rights. I gave the board 7 days to respond and withdraw all fines and threats. But here's the thing that really made my letter effective. Instead of just being angry or threatening, I approached it like a business matter. I documented everything, cited relevant laws, and made it clear that I understood my rights and wasn't going to be intimidated. The letter was professional but firm. I wasn't making threats, just laying out the legal reality of the situation and making it clear that I wasn't some pushover they could intimidate. I sent those letters on Monday and got responses faster than I expected. Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was someone who introduced himself as the HOA's treasurer, calling to apologize for what he termed an unfortunate misunderstanding. He assured me that the board took these matters very seriously and would be investigating the situation immediately. What was interesting about this conversation was how genuinely surprised the treasurer sounded. He explained that the first time he'd heard about my property was when he received my certified letter. According to him, Brenda had been handling most of the day-to-day HOA business and had never mentioned anything about a non-HOA property in the subdivision. He asked if I could email him copies of the county documentation I'd referenced in my letter, which I did immediately. Within 2 hours, he called back to confirm that everything I'd claimed was absolutely correct and that the board was calling an emergency meeting to address the situation. Wednesday brought a hand-delivered letter from the HOA's law firm, not the threatening legal action Brenda had promised, but a formal apology and complete withdrawal of all fines and demands. The letter stated that after reviewing the property records, they confirmed my address was not subject to HOA jurisdiction and expressed regret for any inconvenience. But the real fireworks were just getting started. Thursday evening, I got a knock on my door from a different board member, a guy named Robert who lived a few streets over. He looked genuinely embarrassed as he explained what had been happening behind the scenes, and what he told me was more shocking than I'd expected. Apparently, Brenda had never told the rest of the board about my property's status. When I sent my letter to all 5 board members, it was news to 4 of them that there was even a non-HOA property in the middle of their subdivision. They'd trusted Brenda to handle neighborhood issues and never questioned her reports about violations and fines. But here's where it gets really interesting. When they started digging into the situation, they discovered this wasn't the first time Brenda had used her position to settle personal grudges. There had been other questionable fines and violations that seemed more about her personal preferences than actual rule violations. Robert told me about a family 2 streets over who'd been fined repeatedly for having the wrong type of outdoor furniture on their deck. When the board looked into it, they found that Brenda had a personal dispute with these neighbors over a parking issue and had been using HOA authority to harass them. There was also an elderly man who'd been cited multiple times for his garden gnome collection. Turns out Brenda just didn't like garden gnomes and had been making up violations to force him to remove them. The actual HOA bylaws said nothing about garden decorations as long as they weren't offensive or dangerous. The board member explained that they were now facing potential legal liability for Brenda's actions. Threatening to place a false lien on someone's property wasn't just harassment, it was potentially a serious legal matter that could expose the entire HOA to lawsuits. He also mentioned that they'd discovered Brenda had been using HOA funds to pay for a lawyer to send threatening letters without board approval. She'd essentially been running her own little fiefdom using the HOA's resources and authority. But I wasn't done yet. Brenda had threatened my property, and I wanted to make sure there were actual consequences for her behavior. Friday morning, I filed a formal complaint with the county about the attempted lien threat. I took all my documentation down to the county clerk's office and met with someone from their property fraud division. The investigator who handled my case was a woman who'd been dealing with property disputes for over 15 years. She explained that they take false lien threats very seriously because they can damage someone's credit and ability to sell their property. Even the threat of placing an invalid lien can cause real financial harm. She reviewed all my documentation and concluded that there was clear evidence of harassment and misuse of authority. While she couldn't promise criminal charges, she said the county would definitely investigate and could issue formal warnings or sanctions if they found evidence of deliberate misconduct. I also sent a follow-up letter to the HOA board, not backing down, but escalating. I pointed out that their president had used official HOA resources and authority to pursue what was essentially a personal vendetta. I mentioned specific legal terms like tortious interference and noted that I was keeping all my options open regarding potential civil action. What really drove the point home was when I included a timeline of all Brenda's actions, from the initial surveillance of my party to the escalating threats and harassment. When you laid it all out chronologically, it painted a clear picture of someone who'd decided to abuse their authority to settle a personal grudge. The response was swift and decisive. The following Tuesday, I received another letter from the HOA board. This one informed me that Brenda had been removed from her position as president and would no longer have any authority to communicate with residents on behalf of the association. The new board president had signed a document formally acknowledging my property's exempt status and promising that my address would be flagged in their system permanently. But the best part was still coming. The new board president was a woman named Patricia who seemed to actually understand what community leadership was supposed to look like. 2 weeks after Brenda's removal, Patricia showed up at my door with a gift basket full of local products and a handwritten note of apology. She explained that the board was horrified by what had happened and wanted to make sure there were no hard feelings between the HOA and my property. She also mentioned that they'd discovered some irregularities in how Brenda had been handling other neighborhood issues and were working to clean up the mess she'd left behind. Patricia told me about the investigation that had followed my complaint. Apparently, once they started looking closely at Brenda's activities, they found a pattern of selective enforcement and personal vendettas disguised as HOA business. She'd been using her position to settle scores with neighbors she didn't like while ignoring actual violations by people she considered allies. The county investigation concluded that while no criminal charges would be filed, there was clear evidence of harassment and misuse of official authority. Brenda received a formal warning that any future incidents could result in more serious consequences, including potential civil liability. But for me, the real satisfaction came 3 months later when I decided to throw another party. This time I went all out. I rented a small stage for a local band, set up proper outdoor lighting, and invited about 30 people for what I called my not an HOA victory celebration. We started at noon and went until nearly midnight, with live music, dancing, and the kind of backyard fun that my grandfather would have loved. I'd spent weeks planning this party, and it was everything the original gathering wasn't. Instead of 4 friends with a Bluetooth speaker, we had a 3-piece blues band with a full sound system. Instead of burgers on a little grill, we had a catered barbecue spread with all the fixings. Instead of a quiet afternoon gathering, this was a full-scale celebration that could be heard for blocks. The guest list included not just my friends, but several neighbors who'd heard about the Brenda situation and wanted to show their support. Word had gotten around about what had happened, and apparently a lot of people had their own stories about Brenda's overreach and abuse of authority. One couple brought a bottle of wine to thank me for standing up to what they called the neighborhood bully. Another neighbor mentioned that since Brenda's removal, the whole atmosphere in the community had changed for the better. People seemed more relaxed, less worried about getting cited for tiny infractions. The band started playing around 2 in the afternoon, and by 4 we had people dancing on the deck and spilling out into the backyard. The music was loud enough that you could hear it several houses away, which was exactly the point. This was my property, and I had every right to enjoy it however I wanted. From my deck, I had a perfect view of Brenda's house. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of her standing at her back window watching our party but unable to do anything about it. No fines, no threats, no harassment, just the sound of people having a good time on property that was completely outside her jurisdiction. Around 6, Patricia, the new HOA president, stopped by with her husband. She complimented the band and mentioned that several neighbors had commented on how nice it was to hear live music in the area. She thanked me for being understanding about the whole situation and said the board was working hard to rebuild trust with the community. What really struck me was how different the atmosphere was compared to my original party. Instead of feeling like we were being watched and judged, everyone was relaxed and enjoying themselves. The cloud of Brenda's surveillance and hostility had been lifted, and you could feel the difference. As the evening went on, more neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves and chat. Some of them mentioned that they'd always wanted to talk to me but had been worried about how Brenda might react. Apparently, she'd made it clear that she considered my property a bad influence on the neighborhood. One elderly couple told me they'd actually been thinking about moving because of Brenda's constant harassment about their landscaping choices. Since her removal, they'd decided to stay and were planning to plant the flower garden they'd always wanted. A younger family mentioned that Brenda had been sending them threatening letters about their children's bikes being left in the driveway. Now they felt comfortable letting their kids play outside without worrying about getting cited for every minor infraction. The band played until about 11 and people started heading home around midnight. As the last guests were leaving, several of them mentioned how much they'd enjoyed the party and asked if I'd be doing it again next year. I told them absolutely, and that anyone who wanted to celebrate living in a free country was welcome. Standing on my deck as the last guests headed home, I found myself reflecting on the whole experience. 6 months earlier, Brenda had tried to use her tiny bit of power to bully me into submission. She'd assumed that throwing around official-sounding threats and legal language would be enough to make me comply with her demands. Instead, she'd learned that assumptions can be dangerous things. She'd assumed I was in the HOA without checking. She'd assumed I'd be too intimidated to fight back. She'd assumed her board would back her up without asking questions. Every single assumption had been wrong. The best part wasn't just that I'd won, but how I'd won. I hadn't gotten angry or made threats. I hadn't stooped to her level of petty harassment. I'd simply done my homework, gathered the facts, and presented them clearly to the people who mattered. When confronted with the truth, even Brenda's own board had to acknowledge that she'd overstepped her authority. They'd realized that supporting her actions could expose them to serious legal liability, and they'd acted quickly to distance themselves from her behavior. But the victory went beyond just my personal situation. situation. By standing up to Brenda's abuse of authority, I'd apparently helped other neighbors who'd been dealing with similar harassment. The investigation into her activities had revealed a pattern of selective enforcement and personal vendettas that went far beyond my case. The new board seemed genuinely committed to running the HOA in a more reasonable way. They'd implemented new policies requiring board approval for any fines over a certain amount, and they'd established an appeals process for residents who felt they'd been unfairly cited. Looking back, I realized that my grandfather had given me more than just a house when he refused to sell to the developers. He'd given me a lesson in standing up for what's right, even when it's inconvenient or unpopular. He'd shown that sometimes the best response to pressure is to hold your ground and stick to your principles. Brenda still lived behind me, but now she was just another neighbor. No special authority, no power to threaten or harass. Just someone who had to live with the consequences of her actions while watching the rest of us enjoy the freedom she'd tried to take away. The whole situation had taught me something important about dealing with bullies, whether they're playground kids or HOA presidents. Sometimes the best response isn't to get angry or fight back with the same tactics they use. Sometimes you just need to shine a light on the truth and let the facts speak for themselves. I went inside that night knowing that my property was permanently protected from future HOA interference. But more than that, I knew that I'd stood up for something important. The right to use your own property as you see fit, as long as you're not actually hurting anyone. Brenda had tried to use fake authority to control behavior she didn't like. In the end, she'd learned that real authority comes from having actual legal grounds for your actions, not just a clipboard and an attitude. 6 months after that first barbecue, I was finally able to enjoy my backyard without worrying about someone taking pictures or leaving threatening notes. My grandfather's property had survived developers and HOA presidents alike, and it would continue standing as a little island of independence in the middle of all that suburban conformity. The donut hole had proven that sometimes being different isn't just okay, it's worth fighting for. And every time I saw Brenda looking out her window at my yard, I remembered that the best revenge isn't getting angry or getting even. It's proving that you can't be intimidated by people who abuse whatever little power they have. Sometimes the most satisfying victory is simply living well and enjoying the rights that nobody can take away from you no matter how hard they try. Anyway, thank you for watching.